All right. We're still in Corinthians. Talked some about the sexual sin as we was in Corinthians and about Paul. Um, how he does different things. We talked about that some as we got into 2 Corinthians or 1 Corinthians 6. And Paul really brings up on this that we're all, and if we get past that, which is where we're at now, Paul brings up a really, really good point here. He says there's a lot of things that are lawful, but not all things are profitable. Boy, that's probably one of the most true statements ever in the world right there. There's a lot of things you can do. There's a lot of things as a Christian you can do. But sometimes it doesn't pay. just throwing that out there. Sometimes it's not a profitable thing. It affects somebody else, or maybe you in a negative way, or maybe it leads to something else with somebody. So, this is something that Paul says that he it's something that we have to think about, right? It's not just about if we can do it, it's whether we should do it. Kind of one of those things. And sometimes that's a real issue for Christians. Paul says, I won't be mastered by anything. What masters us, what controls us is what we serve, right? It's what affects our life. And we can't be mastered by things. We can't let things in the world control us. We have to be the ones that are in control of things within our lives. Self-control is one of the hardest things for us to master, right? And there's so many ways in our lives that affects us, right? I mean, we always think, when we think about that, we always kind of think of things like, maybe drinking or drugs or all kinds of things that be self-control. But the truth is that, I think even self-control not to be on your phone all day, not to be on social media all day. I mean, that's a big thing these days, right? It's easy. I mean, I do it. I get on that phone, start watching them funny boat reels. Man, I love them things. I can sit there and do that all day, The truth is that there's a lot of things can master us, not just bad things. A lot of good things can even master us, right? They take over our lives. We got to be careful about that. We have to have a balance within our lives. And that's something that I think Paul would tell us, right? He goes into this food thing, and to me and you, that's not really a big thing. We don't really struggle with that. We're fixing to have potluck in a little bit. We're going to eat whatever's out there. It's all going to be good. We ain't going to worry about it. Nobody's going to be offended by what we eat at potluck, It's not something that really bothers us that much. But to them, it was a big thing, but it's a good example. And I think that's a good point, right? To them, food was a big problem for a lot of reasons. One of those is that you had Jews and Gentiles. And even though Jews should know it doesn't really matter now if we eat things that are unclean, right? They still, in their brain, it didn't really register, To see somebody eating something that was unclean was still going to bother them, even though they knew probably it was okay, but it was going to make them uncomfortable, right? Because they didn't really like, they're still in their brain. You can't just switch your brain off, right? I mean, you can't do that. So they're sitting there and you're eating a piece of bacon, Well, they probably not have had bacon, but if they didn't, they were missing out. And so you was eating a piece of bacon, right? And that guy sitting next to you, that really would bother them. That's why Paul was saying, all things are lawful. In other words, I can eat any food I want. When Peter saw that sheet coming down out of heaven, had all those clean and unclean, and God said, arise and eat. Don't call anything I've made unclean. In other words, food doesn't matter anymore. But in Peter's brain, it still mattered. You can't just flip it. You can't just flip that switch. And so that's what Paul was saying. So they're eating together. We're going to talk about that later in 1 Corinthians. They're having these meals together. The book of Jude talk about love feasts, right? These agape feasts, they call them, these love feasts, where they eat together. And so they're all eating together. I think their world was so much different than ours that sometimes we have a hard time understanding part of what is being said here. They lived in a different world. They had home churches mostly, I'm sure exclusively probably at this time, or they met maybe in a synagogue or a building. But they traveled. They carried their food with them. We can see that in 1 Corinthians. They brought their lunch. They packed a lunch because you couldn't just run down and get something to eat like we could. So they're eating together, Gentiles, Jews, different types of people, and they're bothered by what these other people are eating. It's not just the Jews and the Gentiles, though, as we're going to get into. It's also food sacrificed to idols. That's a big thing, right? Because if you eat off of food sacrificed to idols, some people think you're partaking with that idol, right? Because that food was sacrificed to an idol. But the other hand is that most of these people were poor. And the truth is, my understanding, when you went to the meat market in those days, and if you've ever been to a meat market in some of those countries, it's kind of a revolting experience. But nevertheless, if you went to the meat market in those days, there were the food sacrificed to idols. It was like when you go to Homeland and it's the meat with the red stickers. You know what I'm saying? It was the stuff that was cheap because it had been sacrificed to an idol, right? It was the bargain bin meat. It was the stuff you could afford. It was like eating, well, hamburgers not cheap anymore. It's like eating, right, ground pork, which I guess will magnify the situation as compared to a T-bone, right? It was a lot cheaper. And these people were poor. They didn't have a lot of money. So they were able to buy this cheaper food, this meat sacrificed to idols. But other people that were there, even Christians, were like, well, you can't do that because if you eat that meat sacrificed to idol, you're partaking in that idol. You're partaking in that temple, and that's a sin. You can't eat that food. So food's a big issue here in this church. It's divisive. It's divisive. I don't want to sit next to you if you're eating something that bothers me. Bothers me to see you eat it. I want to sit next to you if you do that. I want to sit over here with this group of people that eat this kind of meat or eat this kind of food. So once again, we had division. Paul's preaching against division, right? That's why Paul says it's lawful for me. It's lawful for me to eat meat sacrificed to idols. It's lawful for me to eat stuff that's unclean. But maybe when I'm with this group of people and we're eating dinner, it's not profitable for me to do that. Even though it's lawful, it's not profitable, right? So he says, by the power God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall then I take members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he unites himself with a prostitute as one with her in the body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. So why does Paul do that? He starts at the beginning, if you remember this, we start at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 6. We start with this idea of law, right? Going to law, not judging each other. That's where we started. Started with not judging, not being able to judge each other. Can't you judge each other? Why are you taking each other to court? Is there not someone there that can judge among you, right? Because you've got these problems, obviously, and you're not taking care of them. And then he goes into this idea. And then in 7, he says, why would you rather be defrauded, right? In other words, why wouldn't you rather be wronged? It says in New American Standard, defrauded in King James. Why wouldn't you rather be wronged? So there's 2 places in this chapter that he says, you're not the most important person in your life. That's just what he says. 2 places in this chapter, he says, you're not the most important person in your life. Right? At the beginning of this, he says, it's better to lose, it's better to be wronged, it's better to be defrauded than to have a division, right? Why wouldn't you just rather be wronged? Then if you look at the bottom of this, where he said, all things are lawful for me, but it's not profitable, right? So 2 places in this, he said, you're not the most important thing. Other people are more important than you. How your life affects other people is more important than your life. That's a good thing to remember. I should remember that more because that's a true, very true statement, right? I think. Is there any comments? Y'all can jump in here anytime you want. Just jump right in. So he starts out with his lawsuits. Then he goes into this immorality, right? Don't you know these type of people won't inherit the kingdom of God? And he's got a long list, right? Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, effeminate, homosexuals, thieves, covetous, drunkards, rivalers, swindlers will not inherit the kingdom of God. I've been a little bit of a rivaler in my life. Um, the truth is that we always look at this list, I think, and we focus on the sexual side of it because that's probably where we're most, I wouldn't say controversial, but maybe that's the biggest thing we think about, and we kind of forget 10, right? Well, yeah, probably. But we kind of forget 10, right? Covetousness, right? Rivaler, somebody who likes to kind of stir trouble. Swindlers, desiring what somebody else has. Coveting. Well, plotting to get it. Yeah. So sometimes we forget 10. We forget, and then drunkards here's to excess is really the word in the Greek. So it's like anything to excess, It's like being excessive. But Paul says you've changed in 11, right? We talked about all this. I'm just reviewing. Paul says you've changed. Some of you were this, but now you're not anymore, right? You've been sanctified by Christ. And then he talks about, and then he goes into this lawful and profitable. Then he goes into food. And then after he goes into food at the end, right, then he goes back almost into this idea of sexual sin again, right? This idea of uniting yourself to a prostitute. But what you have to understand, I think, in Paul's writings is when you get to 15, it's not just about saying, once again, we gravitate on that, well, I'm never going to go get a prostitute, I'm never going to pay for a prostitute. Hopefully not. So you go, we get into that idea, but I think it's a broader spectrum. It's kind of encompassing a lot of what he's been saying all through this chapter. Jesus said Israel was an adulteress, right? Israel was an adulteress, right? And Israel was an adulteress because they went after other idols. They served other gods. They did other things. They weren't faithful to God. Now, that doesn't necessarily, and that encompasses a broad thing, right? It's not necessarily saying they were just serving idols. That would be the simple answer, but it's not the right answer. The right answer is adultery is turning your heart away from something. It's turning your heart towards something else. That's what Israel did. Israel turned their heart away from God, whether it was to serve an idol, whether it was not to serve God in the way that they should serve him, whether it was to neglect God. They had become an adulterer, right? They had turned their heart away from God. Do you think that, how can I phrase this properly? Do you think that, do you think it's possible to commit adultery without ever physically committing adultery? Absolutely, right? Yeah. So, the truth is that what Paul's saying here is that any of these things that we drag us away from God, any of these things that come between us and God, that we're uniting ourselves with, that becomes a problem, right? That becomes a problem. Paul says, though, sexual sin is within the body. And here he says, the two become one flesh. Why does he say that there? Why does he, when we read that in the Old Testament, it says, a man shall leave his mother and father and be joined his wife. The two shall become one flesh. What do you think that means? Yeah, permanently joined. When are you married in the Bible, in the Old Testament? I mean, that's an adult class, right? so hopefully, almost. So when are you married in the Bible? When you join together sexually. That's it. Matter of fact, if you read the Old Testament, it says if you go to a foreign land and you conquer a nation and you find a maiden who's pleasing to you, that you take her to your house, that you let her go through her period of mourning, that you go into her and she becomes your wife. It's funny because in the Bible, how many marriage ceremonies are there in the Bible? Well, there's one, right? The marriage in Cana, right, where Jesus turned the water into wine. But is there anything else? Can anybody tell me any place else in the Bible that anybody's ever married? Stood before somebody and be married in the Bible ever? No, doesn't exist, right? Go to the bridegroom, yeah. You're waiting for the bridegroom, the parable of the virgins, the 10 virgins in the Bible, where they're waiting for the bridegroom to come and enter the wedding. And Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to a marriage feast, right? Where he says, if you're not invited and you're not dressed in the right clothes, remember that? You're not dressed in the right clothes, you're going to be kicked out if you're not invited, right? Because it's a marriage of God and his people. But once again, in the Bible, it's really interesting we start talking about marriage in the Bible. You know, it's always, in the Old Testament especially, it's not in the really New Testament reference, but in the Old Testament, it's a pretty clear-cut case. It has to do with consummation of that bond. So once you do that biblically, you've become one flesh. That's really what that means in the Bible. Now, I always, in my mind, I always think it's because when people are married 40 or 50 years, they start looking alike, talking alike, walking alike, and you can't tell them apart. But that's really not what that means. But it means the two become one, right? That's exactly what that means. It's a consummation of that relationship. So in a biblical sense, we really don't have examples of what we would consider marriage in our society, where you go before someone and you actually are married. It has to do with that in the Old Testament. So it's when we start talking about this uniting with a prostitute, in other words, what Paul's really saying here is that at that point you've become one flesh, and at that point, then anything else you do becomes adulterous. So it kind of all ties together, I guess. But that's why he brings this back up, the one flesh thing. The two will become one. Yeah. No. No, it don't matter how you dress. Well, I mean, it does to an extent. But, I mean, you wouldn't want to dress. Yeah. But, I mean, no. And, I mean, you know, we've divided over stuff like that for years. It doesn't make any sense. But you know, really what we're talking about here is this idea of division over bigger things. And we shouldn't divide over especially stupid little stuff, which we have for so many years. But this is really bigger stuff. Sure. Right. Yeah, we almost have to be kind of above the law, essentially, in that respect. So Paul goes on and he says, he who unites himself with the Lord is one with him in spirit. The idea here is that we're joined to God, you know. So when you're married, that's a covenant relationship, right? We've talked about that a lot of times. You know, that's one of my things I talk about a lot, right? That's a covenant relationship. You covenant with somebody. You basically stand before God and whoever and say you're going to be this kind of person, and then you give a ring as a sign of covenant, and you become married in our society. You're married. With Christ, when we're baptized into him, that baptism is a sign of our covenant, right? And it unites us, and we're one with him. because we're one with Christ, anything else that we do, essentially, that draws us away from God, just as Israel was drawn away from God, we can be drawn away from God. We can become the adulteress. If that makes any sense. We can become the one who denies God. We can be the one who doesn't serve God the way we should, who doesn't be the person that God wants us to be. And then Paul drives back into this sexual immorality. This is a really big problem in Corinth, isn't it? It's a really big problem. You know, we think this kind of sin is unique to us, you know. It's as bad now, but the truth is it was bad then, and it's always been bad. He says, every other sin a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. Then he says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? We need to talk about this a little bit. So, don't you know your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? What does that mean exactly? Who is in you? You have received from God. You are not your own. See, me and you, we don't understand temples because we're not temple people, right? There's no temples in Oklahoma. Well, there's probably something that's called a temple, but we're just not temple people. We don't understand that. Temples to us are way over there somewhere. You know, what do we think of? What do you think of when you think of a temple? Really, what's the picture pops into your brain? If I say temple, what picture pops into your brain? Just curious. Huh? Dome of the Rock, right? The mosque, maybe. You know? If you say temple to me, you know what pops in my brain? It's like the Parthenon or the Pantheon or those Greek temples. That's what always pops in my head. If you say temple to me, I see that Pantheon, you know? I see those big Greek temples. That's what I see. That's what my head sees. That's just what I see, right? Right. So temples don't mean nothing to us anymore, right? I mean, we know we don't have to go to Jerusalem to worship. So we're not temple people. So temple texts, they just kind of run right over the top of our brain because they always have me. And trust me, this, up until about 4 years ago, I really didn't understand any of this temple text business. I didn't understand that at all. It's just something I've kind of recently got into looking at because I really got started looking at Genesis, and I really started looking at God resting and that idea, and that's what got me thinking about temples. Because temples, this place is full of temples. I didn't understand that till I went over there. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. If you've never been over there, ever been to Greece, it's hard to even imagine the amount of temples. They're on every corner. I mean, it's unreal. We went to this little island, Delos, which is just ruins now. Little bitty thing. I mean, it's the size of Dustin, right? If you know where Dustin is. And really there's like 90 or 100 temples in this little thing. Temples to everything. Gods I never even heard of in my life. I mean, every corner there was a temple. And you're like, what are temples? Why did they build temples? Why did people, because throughout ancient history, Mesopotamia, Mayans, right? I mean, Egyptians, right? Name a culture. Just about name an ancient culture. And you know what we find when we go to look at ancient cultures? You know the one thing that's still standing when we go there? Temples, right? Monuments to whatever god they served. They still there. They're there because that was their center of their culture. It was the center of their life. Temples were everything to them. Why did they build a temple? Why do you build a temple? For God to dwell in. God's rest in temples. That's how it is. God's rest in temples. They built temples for gods to rest in. That's where gods dwelt. That's where they rested. That's where they wanted them to be. But there were temples all over everywhere in Greece. There's temples all everywhere in Corinth. Corinth is full of temples. And these temples is where these people went to make their sacrifice, these gods. It's where they went to appeal to these gods. And they built these really fancy, ornate, amazing structures because they thought, boy, if we can build this big enough and fancy enough and pretty enough that our God, whoever that is, quote, is going to come dwell, and we're going to be able to reach our God, right? And then in John chapter 4, where he meets the woman at the well, right? he says, like Teddy was saying, and the woman says, you Jews say we need to meet, worship in Jerusalem. And our fathers say worship on this mountain. And Jesus says, I tell you, there's coming a day within Jerusalem, this mountain will you worship. True worshipers will worship in spirit and truth. But these people are temple people, right? And if you're a Christian, I think, in that society, one thing you probably really want to do is build a temple to Christ. I would think that, because that's what you did. That's your nature. That's how you were. And we do it. Have we not done that? What about St. Peter's Basilica, right? Do you think that's quite the place, right? Why do we build that big thing? So we feel holy, so God will be there. So I don't know why we do that, because that's how we're built. It's how we're wired, right? And so we build these great structures, even here, the Crystal Cathedral in California, right? We build these amazing structures because we want to I don't know, because that's how we are, I guess. And yet here Paul says, guess what? You're the temple of God. God rests within you, right? But we so took this temple idea, and we've kind of made it this idea that I need to take care of this temple, this outside of this temple, right? I need to take care of the outside of my temple. But haven't you heard that from the pulpit? I've heard that my whole life, right? Don't drink, don't smoke, don't whatever, because your body's a temple of God. And I've seen preachers that literally were on the verge of having a heart attack. They were 200 pounds overweight. That says, don't smoke because your body's a temple. And I'm thinking, where are we missing? We're missing something here, right? Because if you really think that, then you really believe that, then we should be the most healthy, fit, wonderful people on the face of the planet, because we should be taking care of this temple, right? Do y'all believe that, really? Is that what we're talking about here? Because this temple's old, it's decaying, it's gray, it's wrinkled, it's getting worse every day, trust me, right? My knees don't hardly work, my brain don't hardly work half the time. This temple's in a state of decay. Right? If this is a temple of God, it's going downhill in a hurry. So is that really what we're talking about here? Or what are we talking about? God dwells within us. Our body's a temple. But is Paul talking? He's talking about what? He's talking about the sins of our soul, right? He's talking about things that are wrong with us, sins we commit. He's talking about what's inside of us. This body is a temple. Your body is a temple. God dwells within this temple. Now, we can talk all day about how he does that, but let's just leave it at that. God dwells within this temple. But here, I don't think we're talking about this external. We're talking about the internal, right? Yeah, what are you within? Is your soul clean? Is your heart pure? You see what I'm saying? Because if it was the external, and I've heard that my whole life, and it just bothers me, because in my mind we're thinking about the wrong thing here. God is spirit, right? And we're spirit. The temple that Paul's talking about here is what's within us. It's our heart. Where does God dwell? One thing that's always really bothered me, I guess I'll throw this in there. Yeah, we got 10 minutes, so y'all got time to throw things at me. Okay, so anyway, one thing that's always kind of bothered me about this idea of, like physical indwelling, like literally God physically dwells within you, in a literal, like his presence, I don't know how to say it, but this literal indwelling is that, how would that work? Because we always say God can't dwell in the presence of sin, and yet Rex isn't always, there's times Rex isn't probably a place God really would like to be. Just saying that, so does God just like jump in and out? Or anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. How does that really work, And I think the answer to that is, in my humble opinion, is that's not exactly how that works. God dwells within me because I choose to put him within me. I choose to listen to his word, to follow his teaching, to become his disciple, to do that. And if I do that, then I become a temple of God. You become a temple of God. And it's kind of a scary thought, because it means that when people look at you, they kind of should see Christ. And in my life, that doesn't always happen, sadly enough. I wish it always did. I wish I was that guy that was always perfect, always on spot, but I'm not. I'm a very human person. But it's kind of this idea that we should be striving to be the type of people inside of us where God would choose to be, choose to rest.
Keep the worldly sin out of our sanctuary after we have been clothed in Christ, married with Him.
Right.
To do our best to keep the sanctuary clean.
Yeah, so what we do inside, right, keep our sanctuary, keep the inside of us pure, keep the inside of us clean. You know, Paul's talked about a lot of stuff we do outside of the body in this chapter. He's talked about lawsuits. He's talked about sexual sin. He's talked about what we eat. But Paul's really going to start saying about how it's not the outside, it's the inside, right? But what we do on the outside affects our inside. Does that make any sense? What we do on the outside affects our inside eventually, right? You are what you eat, is the old thing used to say, right? You are what you eat. You become what you desire. You become what is outside of you, what influences you, what affects you. Paul says you're bought with a price, therefore honor God with your body. So you and I, we walk a different walk, don't we? We walk a different way. We should look different. You know, I think the worst thing in my life is when I get in a situation and I don't look different. I think I'm more disappointed in myself when that happens than any other time in my life. And that happens to me a lot, seems like, you know? And I just hate that because we should look different. We should. I should. And you should. We should look different, right? On the outside, because if our outside looks different, then our inside should be different. So there's a lot to take in there, right? You know, Paul, he's really started with this sexual immorality idea. Paul wasn't married. And in that society, marriage was a big deal. You wanted to marry off your daughters. They married them off young. A lot of times it was arranged marriages. It was a big thing. A woman in that society should be married probably by the time she was 15 or 16 years old. It was a big deal. Paul, writing to Corinth here, he says something that's really kind of out of context for that society. He said, it's good for a man not to marry. Now, this is how he's leading into this idea, because he's just started talking about sexual immorality, started talking about all those things that go on, and now he's saying, you know, it's good if you don't marry, right? And that's really weird in that society, and even in our society, it's a weird thing to say. It's a weird thing for Paul to say. Now, we know in the Catholic Church, priests aren't allowed to marry. I don't think still, maybe not. I don't know. Pope might change that, but as far as I know, that's true. Not allowed to marry, right? They have to take a vow of celibacy. And that idea comes from the idea that you should be married to God, not married to a woman. So that kind of plays in, I guess, to that theology. But Paul here, he really isn't, he's really leading in because he says, but most people can't handle that. Most men can't handle that. Most people can't handle that because they've got these desires, right? Urges, lusts, things they have to satisfy. Paul says there's a godly way to do that. There's an ungodly way to do that. If you're not worried about that, don't marry. Better not to marry. Just don't, right? Which is really weird in that society. But he says, but since there's such immorality, right, you should marry. And you should fulfill your marital duty to your wife, and likewise a wife to her husband. Marital duty. So when we start talking about this as husbands and wives, we have a responsibility to each other, right? We have a responsibility. Here specifically, we're talking in a sexual sense. We have a responsibility to one another because that's to be taken care of inside of this marriage bond, not outside of this marriage bond. So marriage, in Paul's mind and God's mind, becomes more than just the idea of being together as a couple and having the same goals and having the same dreams and having the same whatever. In God's eyes and Paul's eyes, it's more than that. It's about taking care, essentially, of the lust that we possess within ourselves. That's God's way for us to do that. And since it is, we have a responsibility, husbands and wives have a responsibility to one another to fulfill that. That's part of being married. That's part of what it is. If that doesn't happen in a relationship, a lot of times, what happens in that relationship? Yeah, we have immorality, right? In other words, if that's not happening and there's a problem there, then it needs to be addressed, because God is saying, if it's not, Paul's saying here through Christ is whatever, he says if it's not addressed, that it's going to lead to something else. So we have a biblical responsibility to fulfill each other, not just in a spiritual sense, not just in a words are eluding me today. English is my first language, I promise. But we have a responsibility to fulfill each other in a sexual sense. That's part of our duty as being married. It's part of what marriage is about in Paul's eyes and God's eyes. That you and I find fulfillment within our marriage, within that relationship, so that we don't seek it outside of that relationship. That's a big part of what marriage is about. So that's Paul, in leading through this immorality, he says that all this is going on, all this immorality is going on, but there is a godly way to take care of this, and this is the godly way to take care of this, right? He said the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but to her husband, and in the same way the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to the wife. So in other words, we not only share our lives together, we share our bodies together. That's part of what marriage is. Part of that covenant, that idea that we're joined in that way. And that's, Paul started in with this, the two shall be joined. And we talked about what that means. That's exactly what that means. So once that happens, there's a marriage relationship. There's a responsibility to fulfill inside of that marriage, and that we need to take care of that. It's something that needs to be addressed in a marriage. So these are discussions we should have in the church more than we do, because we tend to not have these discussions. These are things we should talk about. These are things that are important. It's part of who we are as people. It's part of who we are as humans, as being physical beings. This is part of us, every one of us. Every one of us deals with this within our lives, and it's something that we should talk about. And when we tend not to, we tend to not talk about this, and we think we don't want to talk about this, but we need to talk about this, because marriages fail for a lot of reasons. Divorce happens for a lot of reasons. Sometimes this is a reason, plain and simple. So it's something that we need to talk about in the church. We want to be successful. We want to be a good husband. We want to be a good wife. These are godly things to talk about. People say, oh, you shouldn't talk about that. No, we should talk about this. These are godly things to talk about. God made us physical beings. God created us this way. God created Eve, right? Didn't create Steve, created Eve, right? Because he knew what man needed, and there was a reason for that. And we need to understand that reasoning. So these are discussions that we need to have. We'll continue with this next Sunday morning. And so anyway, thanks for your time. See you in a minute.